Días a todos y
Good morning to all of you and welcome to the 2016 Money and Banking Conference of the Central Bank of the Republic of Argentina. It is a great pleasure and honor for us not only to be able to invite and bring together such a distinguished group of panelists to tell us a little bit about their experiences, but also to be able to bring together such distinguished participants, economists, and a lot of people from the country and international guests. So we're very happy to have you all here, and we hope you may enjoy this conference. Argentina is at a very interesting time, and the central bank also going to inflation targeting. And I believe this is the most appropriate panel to give us an overview, not only of the challenges, but also the best ways of implementing an inflation targeting system. The next panelists are Dr. Karnit Flug, who is the governor of the Central Bank of Israel. This is not only a central bank that has inflation targeting, but also has many similarities to the Argentine case. I believe that she will tell us more about that, and we will have also the opportunity to ask questions. After her, José de Gregorio, professor of the Economy Department of the University of Chile, he was also in charge of the Central Bank of Chile from 2007 to 2011. He was governor of the Central Bank of Chile, and from 2003 to 2007, vice governor. And also, we have Arminio Fraga, who is the founder and partner of Gávea Investimentos, and he was also governor of the Central Bank of Brazil from 1999 to December 2002, the time in which they implemented the new inflation targeting system. So I know that you don't want to listen to me, but to them, so that they tell us how they did it. Thank you. Thank you. It is a great pleasure to be here and try to share with you the experience of Israel in the long path of high inflation to stability of prices. Now I will continue in English.
And as I said, it had been a long journey. And just to get an idea what the journey looked like, you can see a graph with the inflation peaking at 450% in '84. Then with a very sharp stabilization program, we reduced it to around 25%. And then we had a fairly long journey, which is the phase of very gradual disinflation. That will be the part that I will focus on in what I'll talk about. And we are now at price stability. Actually, we are battling with negative inflation. And as I told Federico, if somebody would have told us 20 years ago that my challenge as a governor would be to raise inflation to our target level of somewhere between 1% and 3%, I think they would be a little bit crazy, but this is what I'm battling right now with. But I will focus mostly on the disinflation stage. But just to mention how we got there was a very sort of rapid pace of acceleration of inflation, which was basically caused by lack of discipline on the fiscal side, with spending reaching somewhere around 70% of GDP, with a deficit of about 15% of GDP, with debt accumulating to 300% of GDP. That was basically the root cause of inflation, and that was mostly financed by printing money by the central bank. So to get out of that almost hyperinflation or maybe hyperinflation, we had a stabilization program. The successful stabilization program in '85 came after several failed attempts, and that consisted of an agreement between the government, industry, and the trade unions. There were some heterodox elements, some orthodox elements in that stabilization program. It included a sharp reduction in the deficit, freeze of wages and some prices for a very short temporary period. There was a devaluation of 25% of the exchange rate, and it was supposed to be frozen after that. And there was also a very important element, which is a change in the law which prohibited the central bank from financing the deficit. And actually that was a very important change in the law that started, or that was a very important element of the stabilization. So this stabilization, as I mentioned, was successful, and actually inflation went down to around between 20 and 16%, something like that. We stayed with that level of inflation for several years before embarking on a disinflation process, a gradual disinflation process, and I'll focus actually on that part, because I think that is the more relevant part for Argentina at the moment. So as you can see actually in the graph, for several years we stayed at an inflation somewhere between 15, 20 with large fluctuations, and then started moving down all the way up to price stability. So the first stage was actually 86 through 90. The exchange rate was set as a nominal anchor, and inflation rate remained high, partly as a result of the 25% devaluation during the stabilization, with very high pass-through from the exchange rate to prices. Competitiveness was eroded repeatedly, and so we had repeated devaluations, and the exchange rate turned out to be an unsustainable anchor for price stability. In 1990, we actually started moving towards we had the repeated devaluations, with inflation actually remaining quite high due to the high pass-through. In 1990, we had a very large wave of immigration, which was actually, I would say, deflationary in the sense that there was a huge influx into the labor market and downward pressure on wages. So we had sort of an opportunity with some reduction of inflation, which was actually seized, and we started using that later on. Let me move forward. So in 1991, actually we had a decline in inflation, and we reduced the interest rate actually very moderately. So real interest rates actually went up, and that was, I would say, an opportunistic approach to this inflation. We wanted to use this opportunity of the decline in inflation and very gradual decline in interest rate so as to push inflation more permanently down. At the same time, we introduced a diagonal crawling exchange rate band with actually with some widths, and the slope of the band was determined so as to reach an inflation target. So I would say that actually the main tool was the diagonal exchange rate band, and inflation target was at that time introduced through the back door as the way of defining the slope of the exchange rate band. So what you can see here is actually we started introducing inflation target But the main tool was still the exchange rate, the slope of the exchange rate band, and the interest rate was both the exchange rate band and the interest rates started being used as the main tool. And you can see actually the process with inflation targeted initially set at higher level and slowly reduced. By the way, we always the target was always a range and not a single point, with recognizing that actually we don't have the tools for fine-tuning and reaching a very exact point of inflation target. And we also now, our target is between 1% and 3%, and we're not shooting to any particular point within the target. It gives us some flexibility. So the period of 92 to 2000 actually was a period of disinflation, where actually the government intended to have a gradual disinflation. I would say the Bank of Israel was a little bit more ambitious at the time and wanted to use the opportunity of a shock that reduced the inflation to actually move forward towards this inflation. There was some concern of the government of the sacrifice ratio, and I would say that generally there is some price to be paid in the process. At least that was our experience. And we used the combination of exchange rate band and the inflation target, again, which determined the slope, as the main tools for the disinflation. By 1996, the Bank of Israel was seeking, actually, as I said, to reduce inflation somewhat at a faster pace. Monetary policy was quite tight, with interest rate actually being reduced very gradually. And as a result of that, actually the exchange rate was forced downward towards the lower bound of the diagonal band, and as the exchange rate was forced to the lower bound, we had to actually sterilize our intervention, because we had to purchase foreign exchange so as to maintain the exchange rate within the band. And there was quite a substantial need to sterilize this intervention. Interest rate was maintained at quite a high level in order to support this inflation. As a main intervention or a main sterilization tool, we use short-term central bank bonds, and that was the main tool for sterilization. Okay, so as you can see in this period, in this sort of the heights of the disinflation period, the ex-post interest rate, real interest rate, was actually quite high, and we see a fairly rapid disinflation, with inflation actually going below the target. You can see it in the dotted lines, the target set. At the time, the target was set each year for the next year, to some extent based on the previous year's actual inflation. Here, as I mentioned, the exchange rate was forced to the lower bound of the exchange rate band, and we needed to sterilize this intervention. What we used for sterilization of the intervention is mostly the deposits by banks at the central bank, and also what is here called Makam, which is the short-term Bank of Israel bonds. At that time, there was a limit actually on the amount of bonds that we could issue. We had to get, there was a ceiling that was set by the Treasury, and that was actually one of the elements of lack of independence of the central bank to use all the tools or all the in order to perform the monetary policy that was later changed with a change in our law. But as you can see, there was quite a substantial increase in these makam, but mostly in the deposits of the reserves, or actually deposits of the commercial banks at the central bank. Okay, so at that time, actually, inflation at some point got to be below the target, and there was a mounting pressure on the Bank of Israel to release somewhat, or to reduce the level of contraction. And there was actually one episode that I wanted to mention here, where there was I would say, loss of credibility by the central bank as a result of an attempt to reach an agreement between the bank and the Treasury on some kind of a package deal where the Treasury committed itself to reduce the deficit, and the central bank in return reduced the interest rate of the central bank by 200 percentage points. This is considered actually one of the examples for why the central bank needs to be independent and have a committee. This was a very unsuccessful package deal. In fact, very short time after that, due to the loss of credibility, we've seen a very rapid depreciation of the currency. At the time, the pass-through to prices was still very, very high. So we saw a surge in inflation. And as a result, actually, we had to increase the interest rate by 400 percentage point. So that was actually an example of, I would say, when there was too much of there was lack of the independence of the central bank, pressured to prematurely reduce the interest rate, and the price paid for that was quite high. After this event, actually, monetary policy started to adhere very closely to the inflation target. I think there was a clearer consensus that we should focus on the inflation target, and we should follow a rule that would ensure that we're actually meeting the target. And inflation the inflation target became actually the main policy target. We gradually moved from this combination of inflation target and an exchange rate diagonal towards an inflation target as a main target for policy. And the inflation was anchored within the target actually since 2005. Okay, during this period, I mentioned before that we didn't have full independence of the central bank, especially in using some of our policy tools and instruments. And by 2010, after very long deliberation about the new law, actually a new Bank of Israel law was enacted. And that actually, I would say, moved the inflation targeting regime from a de facto into a de jure regime. And the main policy objectives were specified at within the law, and the main objectives are to maintain price stability as the central goal of the central bank, allow 24 months actually to reach the inflation target, which is set by the government. If we deviate from the level from the target, and subject to that, support the economic policy goals of the government, and also support stability and the orderly activity of the financial sector, and actually two very important elements within this law are the independence in the use of policy tools. I mentioned earlier on that we had ceilings on some of our, for example, on the issuance of central bank bonds as a sterilization tool, and that was eliminated within the new law. And the second important element within the law is the establishment of a monetary policy committee with 3 external members, 3 internal members, with the governor having an extra vote if there is a tie. So these are sort of the main elements of the new law, which came about 5 years after we've already reached price stability and where the inflation targeting regime was already de facto actually established. So I'm moving now towards the time. As you can see, actually inflation itself has been hovering or had fluctuated quite substantially, but it has been sort of gradually moving to within the target range. And since 2003, we have been with a fixed target, which is between 1% and 3% at all times. The target itself is set by the government. In periods where we deviated from the target, there were some discussions about changing the target, but that was resisted, and actually it was recognized that we can be outside the target for a while as long as the target serves as an anchor for moving the policy rate in the direction so as to get back into the target range. During the process, you can see that the inflationary expectations, and the key rates actually slowly moved towards price stability. One can see actually that the expected inflation, which is the dotted dark line, has lower movements than the actual inflation. So actually inflation expectations were anchored before inflation actually stabilized as we gained credibility. It took a while, but by 2004, actually 10-year break-even inflation expectations were well anchored within our inflation target range. And the break-even inflation is derived from the difference of the yields between nominal bonds and index bonds. And you can see that basically throughout the period since 2004, even with inflation being very, very low, we're pretty close to the midpoint of our inflation range in terms of our long-term inflation expectations. Another important indicator for the credibility of the inflation targeting regime is the decline in the denomination of contracts in foreign currency. We used to have a very widespread denomination of rental contracts, of housing prices, and other services prices were denominated actually in dollar. And it took a long time of stability before we actually saw a change in that. There was some debate whether we should legislate a ban on the denomination of contracts in dollars. We decided not to. And then finally, by 2007, there was a very sharp drop in the denomination of any contracts in US dollars. But notice that it took a very long time. So we were already several years within price stability before the market actually believed that we're there to stay, and the denomination of contracts in foreign currency was eliminated. So let me talk about a few lessons from our experience, from the Israeli experience with the road of disinflation. I think one of the very important lessons is that we had to focus on inflation and pay, during the period of disinflation, pay less attention to other goals. And we also learned that we have to react quite aggressively to deviations from the target at the stage where the market are still testing us and we had to actually gain credibility that we're very serious in the disinflation process. We found that interest rates is actually very effective in achieving the inflation target. And one complication in our case, which I think is less so in the Argentine case, is that because we came out of very high inflation, we had a lot of indexation arrangements, and that prolonged the period of disinflation because all wages were indexed and many assets were actually indexed. So that actually made the process longer in our case. There was actually a sacrifice ratio that we paid. I think there is no, disinflation does, during the process you actually pay a price and you reap the benefits later. So we use interest rate as the central policy already somewhat when we advanced towards price stability. And I think the ability to use the interest rate is very much related to the development of the financial markets. The ability also to sterilize and issue central bank bonds, the elimination of the ceiling on that was very important. And although we operated also through offering deposits to banks. There was, at the early stages, as you could see, we used the combination of interest rate and the exchange rate. And I think the fact that we needed also to use the exchange rate target, or the exchange rate as a tool was important because at the time, the pass-through was very, very high. So given that the exchange rate had fluctuated quite a bit, that had a very direct impact on prices. So we had to some extent also not neglect the stabilization of the exchange rate to some extent at the early stages of the disinflation. This is actually the balance sheet of the central bank. As you can see, there was a period that when the exchange rate was on the lower bound of the exchange rate band, we accumulated a lot of reserves and we sterilized. I think I talked about that. One of the benefits that we reaped of the disinflation was the ability to issue long-term nominal government bonds. Actually, now we issue also 30 years nominal bonds. And that actually happened when long-term inflation expectations were already well anchored within the target range. We actually measure, and we use that very extensively, we measure the credibility or our long-term inflation expectations, looking at the difference between the yields on the nominal and the indexed bonds, sorry. And we eventually moved to free float when pass-through from the exchange rate to inflation has already declined. So, by the way, that happened most dramatically when prices stopped being denominated in foreign exchange. That was a sharp drop in the pass-through. This is just to show the market share of non-indexed government bonds that has increased to roughly about half at this stage. And, well, I think that the flexible inflation targeting, which, as I mentioned, we have according to the law, we have 24 months to get back into the inflation range if we're out of there, allows us to have temporary deviations from the target range, something that I think is more important at this stage once you reach price stability. But also, I think it's important to recognize that it's very hard to be very precise, and we don't have the tools for very sort of extreme fine-tuning and reaching a very precise target. So I think that's the width of the target, which is between 1% and 3%, has been quite useful. Generally, our policy tries to be forward-looking. We're trying to be ahead of the curve, and we also use the expectations about the global economy as a guide because we're a small open economy, as a guide to where the economy is going, and that helps us to actually be ahead of the curve. Well, I think I can skip that. By the way, I didn't talk about the current challenge. I just mentioned at the very beginning that our current challenge is with very low inflation, actually negative 0.7, and our interest rate is at 0.1. I think we've been using the interest rates quite extensively and quite in a flexible way. So far, our regime we make 12 decisions a year, so we decide every month, and we've been using the flexibility of this tool quite extensively. So just few final points. The initial stages of inflation targeting required a very clear focus on inflation and being quite aggressive. I think that you can, if it's necessary, you can enhance the tools by the absorption or sterilization tools by using central bank bonds. Of course, if you have a managed float and you intervene, you need to sterilize. You can actually loosen the stance only once expectations are well anchored. And generally, you have to be forward-looking and outward-looking when using your policy tools. I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much.